Hello and welcome to the second installment of our Agile Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, maitre d'. I don't know what the best way of describing my role is. Herder of cats, perhaps. Dave West, CEO and product owner here at Scrum.org. And I'm very fortunate to have two awesome English people on the line. David Carmichael from Avanade and Simon Jones from Serious Decisions, now owned or merged with Forrester Research. David, Simon, welcome to the podcast today.
Hello.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And as you may have noticed, we're all English. I do apologize. We'll try not to use too many Englishisms as we go through today's podcast. So this is the second podcast. First one, we really introduced the series, talked a little bit about why we're here, what we're doing, what is Agile marketing. Today, though, we're going to be talking about the Agile operating model with respect to marketing and how that affects. Interestingly, when we started talking about this, we found that there's two situations around Agile really as being used, Agile marketing as it applies to product development. So you've got an Agile team doing Agile product development, and then you've got a marketing organization trying to support them. And then Agile for marketing on its own sake. As we talked more about this and talked about the operating model and what it meant, we came to a fundamental sort of everything's the same, everything's different moment around product ownership and the role of the product owner, a pivotal role within Scrum and within most Agile implementations, because ultimately you have to make decisions and deliver value, right? So you need somebody making those decisions relatively quickly. So Simon, when we started talking about product ownership, you had a particular, I think you described as an epiphany. I'm not totally sure what that is, but when you were thinking about it.
Yeah, it kind of comes down to the idea of what buyers are and what users are in B2B. In B2C, it's a little bit simpler because in B2C, generally, you could say that your user is your buyer because you're the software, you're selling it to that user is buying it directly, and they are also the person that you are the product owner or the product marketer for at the beginning. But in business to business, it's a bit different, right? Because the users aren't necessarily the people that when you're generating demand, when you're speaking to them in marketing before they actually buy something, they're not necessarily the people that are going to be sitting in front of those keyboards. So the question here is that product owner, as you're going through the development, going to be the same person focusing on the same people that, say, a product owner or program owner would be when they're actually generating demand or doing all the marketing stuff before somebody buys products, and even through the life cycle? Because you may be speaking to a chief marketing officer or a chief information officer or a chief finance officer or a director or a manager who will never innately in themselves use that product. You'll still be talking to the users, but actually you'll be looking at champions and influencers, ratifiers and decision makers as a group of people, because that's how stuff tends to be bought in B2B. It's not bought by an individual, it's bought by a group of people, and they play different roles and they interact at different parts of that buying cycle. They go through and buy it. So is that product owner that you have in the development cycle the same product owner that you have when you're actually going through the marketing of that product to individual organizations?
So what you're basically saying, Simon, and I really want to get your take on this, Dave, in a second, because what you're saying is maybe there's different product owners during either maybe at the same time, which sort of gets complicated, but with respect to specialist sort of focus areas. So as a product owner for the development of a product, I would have a responsibility for serving that customer and that buyer, et cetera. But I would be focused on their needs of functionality and the like. And you're saying as a marketeer, maybe there's another product owner that's focused on the product from a marketing point of view. Now, Dave, you are, I think, a product owner for certain things, services that you deliver at Avanade, certain campaigns that you deliver. How do you organize ownership in your marketing world?
Yeah, I mean, I listened to Simon and yourself discuss that. It really can get relatively complicated relatively quickly. I think the way I would view it is, if I think of myself as a product marketer, then, but actually a product marketer in a services company, and it'd be too easy for us to address this purely through software product ownership, and that track we'd lose the majority of our audience. So I want to try and keep us honest in terms of what product ownership could be outside of that obvious Agile and Scrum software development approach. So I think I see myself as the product owner, certainly around the messaging and story development. And that is the messaging and story that may relate to certain products and services that our company or other companies may produce. Somebody else may be responsible as a product owner, product manager of that product or service. My job is to effectively partner with them to produce the product marketing aspect of that. I then arguably have handoffs to other people within the marketing organization who may be responsible for the campaign which may incorporate that product or service, or the external communications that may incorporate that product or service. Somewhere along the line, which is what is important, is who owns the vision and therefore decides on what is the most best way to prioritize work that generates the most value, which is what we should be looking at and focusing on as a product owner. We've had an interesting time with that debate within Avanade, our own company, and how we approach it. We're now starting to focus in terms of how we ratify and how we decide upon it is who owns the vision, and how far up the chain can you take the vision to find somebody to actually help decide what work we prioritize. And that's kind of how we view the role of the product owner. So there are times in marketing where the focus moves in terms of what the priority is, in terms of the stage that you are in the service or product development, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You sort of highlighted a really important point, which is who owns the vision. Because ultimately, the development and operationalizing, the sort of like separation, may not make as much sense as it historically did because your products and services change so frequently, right? So historically, we always used to think that, development organization, one product owner, product manager, whatever, would spend their time developing that and then would hand off a shrink wrap thing with a series of features to a marketing organization. Off they'd go with it. It's a lot more dynamic, particularly with software as a service, particularly with, modern products. You get so much data continuously. You can potentially be continuously releasing new features, right? Or in your case, you can continuously be homing the messaging around your services and your value proposition to the market based on real customer data. So does that separation make as much sense? I mean, you're, as an analyst, you spend a lot of time talking to customers. I assume they're organized around that sort of demarcation, but is that the right demarcation?
And I think it depends on the organisation. So I work with, I was talking to a client late last week, and they are totally integrated. It is one team. Their planning, their vision is absolutely one, and that works for them because they have a very defined product with a very defined group of buyers and users for it. You look at other organisations that are more complex, where they've got multiple product lines, multiple end users, and it becomes less easy to do that and less easy to coordinate. And it's a combination of, and I think this is something that Agile over many years has been working on a number of different variations and ways to address this, is how do you scale that up into something that can work effectively and efficiently in an organization of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people. And I think Agile has, you can do that, and it's a question of where do you make your, if compromises isn't the right word, it's too negative, where do you make your decisions as to where you hold that value, where you hold that vision, and how you separate that vision out. I mean, it would be great if you could have a multidisciplinary Agile team of 200 unitarily working, but that's not gonna happen. So you have to start chunking that up into different components. And there's no one single solution, I think, is what I'm realizing as I'm speaking to clients and getting into this. You've got to tailor that and work on the principles, the fundamental principles of Agile, to say how you tailor it and where you take it.
It's interesting you use the word compromise. And then you said, oh, well, it's not necessarily such a negative word, but ultimately scale is compromise because there's only so much level of complexity and chaos you can survive at scale and still add value. The sort of like the Mythical Man Month is a classic by Fred Brooks, is a classic software book that sort of led many people to start questioning how software development was done in the 70s. And ultimately it said, give me 10 developers and it takes a month to piece of software was built. Give me 11. Does that mean it's less time? No, probably more time. And so you have to look at where you compromise for internationalization, where you compromise because, but at the end of the day, maybe what we're seeing at Scrum.org is that at a certain size, it starts to break apart a little bit. And perhaps one of the reasons why the most agile organizations, companies like Amazon, are so successful is because they are cheap in terms of how many people are involved in things and lean in terms of their focus.
And they're blessed with very little legacy as well, which kind of helps.
Absolutely agree.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely agree with you. I think it's true.
Yeah, and legacy adds to the complexity as well. So just to sort of so there was a lot of different things there. So to summarize, David, you're increasingly starting to organize around vision ownership, as it were. And then though you're sort of like the Santas and elves kind of analogy, you're that vision owner is the Santa, the product owner, and then you've got a lot of elves working with that product owner to do lots of stuff, but ultimately the accountability and the decisions about where value is going to focus on is with that person. Would that be a way to summarize what you described, Dave?
Yeah, I'd probably more in the true context of Scrum that we do that in a as a collaborative way as well, and in a partnering way, I think. But yeah, increasingly we are focused on how we generate value for the business in terms of how we prioritize our work, and that how we focus on the business value should come from the vision of what it is that we're doing. And it's something that came to my mind when you were talking as well, both of you, is this, when we talk about releasing software, we say until we've released it and find out what our users think of it, it's kind of a hypothesis. Because we're second guessing on what we think the impact of it would be. And you can argue that the same is true of what we do from a marketing perspective, whether it's some aspect of a campaign or content or comms or whatever it is. And, one of the other areas that we're looking at in our organization more is, how do we know if it's good or not? Many organizations, marketing organizations, they produce an awful lot of content. And they will produce, if you like, a campaign nurture flow, and they'll tweak that nurture flow based on the responses that they get. But do they ever go back and actually look at the content itself that's in the nurture flow and think, to what extent can I do that differently? Or is that just something that we all strive to do but never get around to doing? And how big a miss do we have if we don't do that? I'm sure Simon's got a view on that as well. But that's one of the things that take an agile approach that, we talked about empiricism last time, and transparency, inspection, and adaptation. So we can be transparent in what we develop, but how well do we actually inspect, as in measure the impact of what we're putting out in the marketplace and adapt it based on the feedback that we get on how well it goes down.
Yeah, and fundamentally, the question around measurement is at the heart of this whole agile hypothesis, right? I mean, hate to use the word hypothesis and measurement and everything all in the same sentence, but ultimately, what agile is built for is to work with complex problems, and therefore requires you to inspect and adapt. Ultimately, you cannot be empirical without that way of measuring your success, and then the ability to inspect and adapt. That's where your agility comes in, right? So measurement is a fundamental to everything. So Simon, measurement's got a lot more sophisticated over the last years, right? How we can measure the success of programs, etc. Is it around sort of like grouping measurement of a customer? Should we align product ownership around customer and the measuring of that? Anything that we can learn from that?
Yeah, I always use the analogy when I talk about always, often, occasionally use the analogy of
you have at least once.
Yeah, I have once. Of Schrodinger's cat. The idea of in fact what marketing is becoming is it's not marketing anymore. It's quantum marketing. It is down at that level. And the Schrodinger's cat experiment fundamentally goes: you put a cat in a box, you seal the box, you put a piece of atomic material with a half-life that says at any given time that cat could be dead or it could be alive. There's 50-50 chance it'll be alive, 50% chance it'll be dead. But you only actually see whether it's dead or alive when you open the box. So while the box is closed, while you're not observing it, the cat is both dead and alive at the same time. It's the act of observation that resolves it, dead cat or alive cat. And that applies fundamentally to David's point about around marketing and campaigns. If campaigns are the big bets the organisation is planning to generate additional revenue or to main revenue or to increase profit or to whatever those big objectives are, we now have the ability to almost at that quantum level measure it and see the interactions of those measurements to define whether being successful or not. But what we're not doing, and I think this is where Agile is really important, we're not actually changing our behaviors to enable us to act upon those observations and measurements that we get, right? So
Yeah.
back to empiricism as being a key foundation of it. If we can measure everything, which we kind of pretty much, compared to 30 years ago, we can pretty much measure things, and whether you like it or not, you can measure cookies across multiple transactions even before you know who they are with a lot of technology nowadays. We should at least, if we're doing that measurement, not just be putting it in a report at the end of the month. We should be using it and saying, okay, we're seeing this is working, we're seeing it's not working. Is it, to your point, is it a piece of content? Is it the vehicle, the delivery mechanism we're using? And we should be going back and adjusting. And if you're going to do that, then the logical conclusion is you have to organize yourselves to be able to create content and create campaigns and programs in an agile way.
Wow, that's kind of profound. So ultimately, one of the biggest challenges when you have these very complicated, decoupled organizations with, set specializations of labor, etc., and that work flows through it in a very efficient way, is what do you do when you find something out along the way that means that you have to change? It's really hard. Therefore, the easiest way to drive change is by having a single team, right? Or a series of teams involved in it with one clear product owner.
Absolutely. And in the case of a campaign, it's a lot easier to change something you haven't made already. Yes, it's a lot easier to change something you haven't made already.
Yes.
Than it is to. I should listen to myself a little bit more, shouldn't I? To change something you haven't created already, than to go back and take something and adjust it based around it being created already and then realizing that it wasn't going to work.
Exactly. So I'm very conscious of our time, and last time we definitely overstayed our welcome a little bit, and we're coming up to the 20-minute sort of time frame. So I just want to sort of just summarize and then just get your sort of closing thoughts. What we talked about is alignment of your teams to outcomes. Ultimately, we believe, and I think was to product outcomes in some value outcome to a customer, to a buyer, to some sort of decision maker in some logical way. We can't tell you how to align. I think Simon made that very clear. Every organization is slightly different. Every organization has a series of constraints that determine that alignment, but ultimately that's very important. Vision, Dave said basically that the most important role of the product owner is to have some sort of vision and to connect that to the outcomes and be able to inspect and adapt that vision based on the action of the cat being dead or alive, to do that very depressing analogy that Simon brought up. Hopefully your cat's alive. And then it comes back to measurement, the ability to measure and measuring your value, feeding that process back. And then Simon had this very profound statement, which was really around ultimately it's no good if you can measure if you can't therefore elicit change, which then comes back to the alignment. Where is your change going to happen? Building these multifunctional teams is crucial. Gentlemen, I'm trying to summarize today's session. Dave, Simon, what anything to add? Have I got anything wrong there? Was that a good summary, do you think?
I think it was great, Dave, to be honest with you. I think you really did a good job of capturing it. It's almost like you've been involved in this for several years.
Surprisingly good, yes.
Yeah. No, go as far up the food chain as you can to find who owns the vision. Think Steve Jobs and things like that in terms of who can really drive that. And from a practical perspective, from a marketing perspective, what value are you going to bring to the business in your current work? We call it sprints, but whatever you want to call it. And by that, I mean, if it's a campaign, then what you're going to release in your foreseeable future that's actually going to impact your ability to generate demand and focus on those business outcomes.
Simon, any final words?
It's all kind of open for clarification now, because the change in marketing has been so massive over the last 30 years. It's still a really young science, as it were, as is kind of Agile in terms of Agile methodology and program management, that we're not always going to have answers, but we can have direction and we can try this stuff out, try Agile out in an Agile way, hypothesize about how everything is going to work. As you say, find the right people with the value, where that vision is, and implement it and try it and adjust it and learn whether it works or not for you as an organization.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to today's podcast. We tried to keep it to the 20-minute sort of time frame. A lot of things to talk about. This is a very interesting and emotive subject because ultimately our ability to better align our teams, better understand their needs, describe hypotheses, execute against those hypotheses, and then inspect and adapt and learn, it will have a huge impact not only on the businesses but also the value that the customer gets, because marketing does have a moral responsibility to communicate value to customers of the products that you're selling. So hopefully we can use Agile to do a better job of that. So a very interesting subject. My name's Dave West. I'm here with Dave Carmichael, Simon Jones here talking about Agile marketing. Expect to see another podcast in the next few weeks. I think we'll continue on the operating model and maybe talk a little bit about cadence and structure. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
This podcast is copyright of Avanade, the leading provider of innovative digital and cloud services, business solutions, and design-led experiences.